What happens when one of the greatest actors of our generation walks onto a morning talk show expecting a respectful conversation, only to be blindsided by a host with an agenda? It only took 40 seconds of condescending questions before Anthony Hopkins had enough, and what followed was a television moment that left the entire studio in absolute silence. Anthony Hopkins arrived at the studio that morning like he always did, humble and prepared. He'd been doing press tours for decades, once sitting through countless interviews with grace and professionalism. This was supposed to be another routine appearance, a simple chat about his latest project. But from the moment he walked onto Lorraine Kelly's set, something felt different. The studio lights were harsh, brighter than usual. Hopkins took his seat on the couch, adjusting his jacket as the makeup team did final touch-ups. Across from him sat Lorraine Kelly, flanked by her regular panelists, Sarah Bennett and Marcus Cole. Sarah was known for her celebrity gossip segments, always digging for drama. Marcus handled the entertainment news, usually playing along with whatever direction Lorraine wanted to take things. The cameras started rolling. Lorraine opened with her signature smile, the kind that looked warm on screen, but never quite reached her eyes. Well, 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 Lorraine began, leaning back in her chair with exaggerated comfort. Anthony Hopkins, everyone. The man who needs no introduction. Or does he? I mean, how many people under 30 even know who you are anymore? Hopkins blinked, clearly taken aback by the opening. He maintained his composure, offering a polite smile. "I'd like to think my work speaks for itself," Hopkins replied calmly. "I don't make films for any particular age group. I make them because I love the craft." Sarah Bennett jumped in, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "But Anthony, let's be honest. Your last film barely made any noise at the box office. Do you ever feel like maybe your time has passed? Like maybe you should step aside for younger talent?" The question hung in the air like poison. Hopkins shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, just slightly. "I don't view acting as a competition between generations," he answered, his voice steady but firm. "There's room for everyone. Always has been." Lorraine laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the studio. "Oh, come on now. You can't seriously believe that. Hollywood is obsessed with youth. They want the next big thing, not the old guard clinging to relevance." Marcus Cole nodded along, adding fuel to the fire. "She has a point, Anthony. When was the last time you were offered a role that wasn't, well, the wise old mentor or the aging detective? Aren't you tired of being typecast?" Hopkins took a breath, clearly trying to remain professional. "I'm grateful for any role that challenges me as an actor. Age is just a number. The character's depth is what matters." Lorraine wasn't having it. She leaned forward, her smile turning into something more predatory. "But that's just it, isn't it? You say age is just a number, but the industry disagrees. You're what, pushing 80 now? At what point do you accept that you've had your run and it's time to retire?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Hopkins stared at Lorraine, his legendary composure beginning to crack. "I'm here to talk about my work," Hopkins said, his voice lower now, controlled. "Not to be lectured about my age or my relevance." Sarah Bennett sensed blood in the water. "No one's lecturing you, Anthony. We're just having an honest conversation. Something you Hollywood types aren't used to, I suppose. You all live in your bubbles, don't you?" "I beg your pardon?" Hopkins replied, his eyes narrowing. Lorraine waved her hand dismissively. "What Sarah means is that you've been famous for so long. You've probably forgotten what it's like to face real criticism. Everyone's been kissing your feet for years. Maybe you're just not used to people being direct with you anymore." Hopkins sat back, a look of disbelief crossing his face. "Direct? Is that what you call this? I came here thinking we'd have a professional discussion about my new film. Instead, I'm being attacked for my age and accused of living in a bubble." Marcus jumped back in, clearly enjoying the tension. "Well, what about the bubble question, though? Do you think you're out of touch with regular people? I mean, When's the last time you did your own grocery shopping or took public transport? What does that have to do with anything? Hopkins asked, his patience visibly thinning. Lorraine laughed again, that same cutting sound. It has everything to do with it. You actors make millions, live in your mansions, and then want to come on shows like this and pretend you understand the common person. It's insulting, really. Sarah nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. And then you expect us to care about your little art films that nobody watches. Why should we give you a platform when you clearly don't care about connecting with real audiences? Hopkins placed his hands on his knees, a gesture that suggested he was preparing to stand. I have spent my entire career trying to tell meaningful stories, stories that matter. I've never once claimed to be better than anyone else. But you think you are, don't you? Lorraine interrupted, her voice rising. You think because you've won awards and worked with big directors that you're somehow special, that we should all just bow down and be grateful you've graced us with your presence. The studio crew exchanged uncomfortable glances. This wasn't the usual banter. This had crossed a line. Hopkins spoke quietly now, but there was steel in his voice. I think no such thing. I'm a professional who came here to do a job that apparently involves being disrespected and insulted by people who seem to have a personal vendetta. Marcus leaned forward, smirking. A vendetta? That's a bit dramatic, don't you think? We're just asking questions. If you can't handle a little pushback, maybe you really are past your prime. Past my prime? Hopkins repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Lorraine sensed she was losing control of the narrative. She tried to redirect, but her approach only made things worse. Look, Anthony, all we're saying is that maybe it's time for you to accept reality. You've had an incredible career, truly, but everything has an expiration date, even legends. Sarah piled on, unable to resist. And let's talk about your recent interviews. You've been quite philosophical about aging and mortality. Some might say you're obsessed with it. Is that why you keep taking roles? Because you're afraid of being forgotten? Hopkins stood up abruptly, the microphone pack on his belt pulling at the wires. The sound technician scrambled to keep up. I'm afraid of being forgotten? Hopkins repeated, his voice now carrying the full weight of his emotions. No. What I'm afraid of is wasting another moment of my time with people who have so little regard for basic human decency. Lorraine's smile faltered for the first time. Anthony, sit down. We're in the middle of an interview. An interview? Hopkins shot back, his composure finally breaking. This isn't an interview. This is an ambush. You brought me here under false pretenses to humiliate me on national television. Marcus tried to interject. Now you're being paranoid. We're just doing our jobs. Hopkins turned to him, his eyes blazing. Your job? Your job is to belittle guests? To make them feel small so you can feel big? That's what you consider professional journalism? Sarah stood up too, pointing a finger at Hopkins. Don't you dare lecture us about professionalism. You walk in here with your attitude, acting like you're too good for our show. I walked in here with respect, Hopkins countered, his voice rising for the first time. Respect that clearly wasn't reciprocated. Lorraine stood now as well, her face flushed. You want respect? You earn respect. And sitting there acting superior while we try to have a real conversation doesn't earn you anything. Hopkins laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. A real conversation? You've spent the last 15 minutes telling me I'm washed up, out of touch, and irrelevant. You've questioned my intelligence, my career choices, and my connection to reality. And then you call that a conversation? The studio had gone completely silent except for their voices. The camera operators kept filming, knowing they were capturing something unprecedented. Marcus tried once more to justify their approach. We're allowed to ask tough questions. That's what journalism is. Hopkins shook his head slowly. Tough questions are fine. I've answered tough questions my entire career. But this? This is cruelty disguised as curiosity. This is tearing someone down because you can, because you have a microphone and a camera. Lorraine stepped closer, her voice dripping with condescension. Oh, please. You're a big boy. You can handle a little criticism. Criticism? Hopkins repeated, his voice quiet again, but filled with intensity. Is that what you think this is? Let me tell you what this actually is. This is a group of people who have decided that because I've been successful, because I've dedicated my life to my craft, that somehow makes me a target, that somehow gives you permission to treat me as less than human. Sarah scoffed. Less than human? Now you're just being dramatic. Classic actor, making everything about yourself. Hopkins turned to her, his expression one of profound disappointment. Making everything about myself? You've spent this entire segment making everything about me. My age, my career, my supposed detachment from reality. I came here to discuss a film I'm passionate about, a story I believe in. And instead, you've turned it into a character assassination. Lorraine crossed her arms, clearly not backing down. If you can't handle honest feedback, maybe you shouldn't do press tours. Maybe you should just stay in your mansion and count your money. That was the breaking point. Hopkins began unhooking the microphone from his collar with deliberate, controlled movements. What are you doing? Lorraine demanded. I'm leaving, Hopkins stated simply. I'm leaving because I value myself too much to stay in a room where I'm not valued at all. Marcus stood up quickly. You can't just leave in the middle of filming. That's unprofessional. Hopkins looked at him with something approaching pity. Unprofessional? You want to talk to me about unprofessional behavior? Look around this room. Look at what you've created here. An environment where cruelty passes for content, where disrespect masquerades as discourse. Sarah stepped forward, her voice shrill. You're being ridiculous. We were just having a conversation. No, Hopkins said firmly, placing the microphone on the coffee table between them. You were having a conversation. I was being attacked. There's a difference. Lorraine's face had gone red, a mixture of anger and embarrassment. You're making a huge mistake. Walking off my show like this. Do you have any idea how this makes you look? Hopkins paused, turning back to face her fully. How this makes me look? I'll tell you how this makes me look. It makes me look like someone who has enough self-respect to remove himself from a toxic situation. It makes me look like someone who won't tolerate being treated poorly, regardless of who's doing the treating or how many cameras are watching. Marcus tried one last time. Anthony, be reasonable. We can start over. We can talk about the film. Hopkins shook his head. No, Marcus, we can't. Because nothing about this has been reasonable from the start. You all came into this with an agenda, and I was naive enough to think it would be different. Sarah's voice took on a mocking tone. Oh, poor Anthony Hopkins. Can't handle a little heat. What happened to the tough guy we see on screen? Hopkins stopped at the edge of the set, turning back one final time. The tough guy on screen? He's an actor playing a role. I'm a real person who deserves basic respect, just like anyone else. The fact that you can't see the difference is precisely why I'm leaving. Lorraine made one last attempt to maintain control. Fine, leave then. But don't think for 1 second that this doesn't make you look weak. Running away when things get tough. Hopkins smiled sadly. Weak? No, Lorraine. Weak is ganging up on someone. Weak is using your position to belittle others. Weak is hiding behind the excuse of journalism to justify cruelty. I'm not running away from anything. I'm walking away with my dignity intact, which is more than any of you will have when this airs, Sarah shouted after him. Your career is over anyway. This just proves it. Hopkins didn't turn around. He simply raised his hand in a dismissive wave and continued walking toward the exit. The studio remained frozen as the heavy door closed behind him. Lorraine stood there, her chest heaving, clearly trying to process what had just happened. Marcus and Sarah looked at each other, uncertain what to do next. Lorraine finally spoke, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Well, that was unexpected." Marcus tried to laugh it off. "Guess he couldn't handle the real questions." But Sarah had gone quiet, staring at the door Hopkins had walked through. For just a moment, something like doubt crossed her face. Lorraine turned to the cameras, attempting to regain her composure. "We'll take a quick break. When we come back, we'll discuss what just happened here." But as the cameras cut, everyone in the studio knew the truth. They had pushed too far. They had treated a guest, a legendary actor, with contempt and disrespect. And he had done the only thing a person with self-respect could do. He had walked away. The production assistants scrambled to figure out how to fill the remaining time. The camera operators reviewed their footage, already knowing this would be the most talked about moment in the show's history, though not for the reasons Lorraine would have wanted. In the makeup room, someone who had witnessed the whole thing was already on their phone, likely sharing what had transpired. The story would spread quickly, as these things always do. Back on set, Lorraine sat down heavily in her chair. Marcus and Sarah joined her, but the earlier energy was gone. They had gone into this thinking they could create drama, could push buttons and get a reaction that would make for compelling television. They had succeeded, but not in the way they intended. Lorraine broke the silence. "He's being oversensitive." Marcus nodded, but without much conviction. "Absolutely. We were just doing our jobs." Sarah said nothing, still staring at that door. The floor manager approached cautiously. "We need to decide how to proceed. Do we address what happened or move on to the next segment?" Lorraine's jaw tightened. "We address it. We tell our side of the story." But even as she said it, she knew how it would sound. 3 hosts ganging up on one guest, questioning his relevance, his intelligence, his worth, then acting shocked when he refused to tolerate it. In the hallway outside, Hopkins walked toward the exit with steady steps. A young production assistant caught up to him, apologetic and embarrassed. "Mr. Hopkins, I'm so sorry about what happened in there." Hopkins stopped, turning to the young woman with kind eyes. "Thank you, but it's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong." "Is there anything I can do?" she asked. Hopkins smiled gently. "Just remember this moment. Remember that kindness costs nothing, and cruelty costs everything. No matter where you end up in this industry, never forget that." The young woman nodded, tears in her eyes. Hopkins continued to his car, leaving behind a studio full of people who would spend the rest of the day trying to justify what they had done, trying to convince themselves that they were the victims, that Hopkins was being unreasonable, that they were just doing their jobs. But deep down, in places they wouldn't admit even to themselves, they knew the truth. They had crossed a line. They had mistaken meanness for entertainment, cruelty for content. They had forgotten the fundamental rule of hospitality, that when someone comes onto your show, they are your guest and deserve to be treated with respect. Anthony Hopkins had reminded them of that rule in the most powerful way possible, not by yelling or insulting them back, not by playing their game, but by refusing to play at all, by valuing himself enough to walk away from people who didn't value him. And in that moment, in that simple act of self-respect, he had shown more strength and dignity than all 3 of them combined. The studio door closed behind him with a soft click, a sound that somehow felt final. Inside, Lorraine Kelly sat in her chair, preparing to go back on air and explain what had happened. To spin it in a way that made her look justified, made Hopkins look difficult. But she would fail, because sometimes the truth is so clear that no amount of spin can hide it. And the truth was this: Anthony Hopkins came to do an interview, expecting professional courtesy. Instead, he encountered hostility, disrespect, and contempt. And when faced with that treatment, he made the only choice a person of integrity could make. he left, not with anger or vengeance, but with his head held high and his dignity intact. And that image of a legendary actor walking away from people who didn't deserve his time would be the lasting memory of this encounter. Not Lorraine's attempts to justify her behavior, not Marcus and Sarah's mockery, but Anthony Hopkins choosing himself over content, choosing respect over ratings, choosing to be a good guy in a room full of people who had forgotten what that meant. The cameras would keep rolling. The show would go on. Lorraine would try to control the narrative, but none of it would matter. Because in 40 seconds, with a few pointed questions and condescending remarks, they had shown exactly who they were. And Anthony Hopkins had shown exactly who he was, too. The difference couldn't have been clearer.